Good morning. We are here for our panel on biometrics and identity in the South. And I'm extremely nervous, so if I make any mistake, you just keep with me and forgive me. We have an extremely well-rounded panel today. I'm very glad that I have them joining us. In my left, we have Leandro Uciferri from ADC. Leandro is a lawyer and a researcher who's working at the intersection of human rights and technology with a special focus on privacy and freedom of expression issues. He's a researcher for Association of Civil Rights in Argentina. To his side, we have Martín Borghioli from Hiperderecho. He's the project director at Hiperderecho in Peru. He's a lawyer from Bras Pascal University in Argentina, and he specializes in intellectual property and digital rights. And to his side, we have Smita Krishna Prasad, who is the project manager of the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University in Delhi, where she specializes in civil liberties and privacy. And to my other side, we have Oliver Ale, who is a social technologist and researcher and an entrepreneur who has been recently designing a micro-insurance health program for Burmese refugees in Thailand that uses biometric identification. And to his side, we have Professor K.S. Park, who is a professor at Korea University Law School. I'm sure you all know him. And he's the co-founder of OpenNet Korea at .org, and he served as commissioner at the Korean Communication Standards Commission. And if I keep reading his bio, we're going to be here all morning. He has such an amazing career. So we have been having, as a community, the technology community, we have been having this conversation about implementations of biometric technologies in many places. There are several layers to this conversation. What we are aiming to do today in this panel is go through some of the implementations of biometric technology in the Global South and how they interact with the human rights. There is a tension in the way biometric technologies are implemented. They are often portrayed as a way to ensure and to make available economic and social rights for people, and to solve several social and economic issues. There are places where they are portrayed as a solution to violence, to issues in security in the public environment. However, as our panelists will tell you, there is a tension between those implementations and the way we are allowed to conduct ourselves in our public and private lives. So I'm going to start with Leandro. Leandro, Argentina is currently seeing one of the most pervasive uses of biometric technology through the federal system for biometric identification. What do you think are the main and most urgent challenges and risks for human rights as a consequence of this policy? And so please tell us a little bit about how this policy has been implemented in Argentina.
Thank you, Marianne. Okay, so first, in order to give a little bit of background on CBIOS, which is the acronym of the system that Marianne mentioned, the system is basically a national centralized biometric database, which was introduced in 2011 by an executive decree. I mentioned this specifically because a lot of the policies that we see on biometric usually avoid or sort public debate. So it's not a minor detail that it was introduced by only the will of the executive power. So there was no debate in Congress or even public hearings about it. The system basically collects fingerprints and facial recognition patterns from citizens and even foreigners. For citizens, when they renew or when they make the national identity cards or the biometric passports, And for every foreigner visiting Argentina by plane or by ships, if it's even a cruise ship or a ferry from Montevideo, they have to give their fingerprints and their facial recognition patterns to the immigrations office. So we not only have every citizen in Argentina on the database, but also every foreigner who's ever visited Argentina from 2011 and on. So basically, the users of the system are the 4 main federal forces under the Ministry of Security, which are obviously law enforcement bodies. And I already mentioned the Immigrations Office, as well as the Citizens Registry. But not only that, but as we're a federal country, each of the provinces in Argentina can sign sort of cooperation agreements. So each provincial police can also access the database at the national level. So it's not only the registries for that specific province, but nationwide. And by the beginning of this year, in 2017, the system was broadened even more, giving access to certain bodies from the judiciary and the executive who sign also agreements. But this is not mandatory for the bodies within those, the executive and the judiciary, but any body within those powers can sign agreements. So we can see that the system has been widened really broadly in these past 6 years. Although the access to the database is restricted to specific employees that have security levels, the access to the database does not require a warrant. So again, we see another failure in terms of checks and balances that should be in place. What has happened as a result of this is that the system has been used in investigations for petty crimes, most commonly. So agents from the federal law enforcement, or even not even during judicial investigations or law enforcement investigations, but also people from administrative offices have access to the database, and there's little transparency on what cases and under which circumstances those registries are searched. Furthermore, one of the most important things that has happened also is that when we talk about biometric databases, like centralized databases, where every citizen or every foreigner that visits the country is registered, is that it basically poses a threat to the presumption of innocence that is guaranteed in the Constitution, at least in the Argentinian Constitution, because it turns everyone in the database into a possible suspects of a crime that's been investigated. So the thing is that it will only be, that person would only be exonerated after someone from the law enforcement who's researching or who's doing an investigation under a criminal case identifies everyone in the database just to sort out the people who are not guilty of the crime, to say. So we see that there's a reversal in the burden of proof, to say the least, in terms of citizens being searched and identified before they committed even a crime or during the investigation. CBIOS has led to the expansion of the implementation of biometric technology in other state activities. Only in 2017, we've seen 2 big concerns in the use of biometric data. Those are really recent. One is during the 11th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, the federal police and the gendarmerie, I guess, they registered fingerprints from not only the citizens living in a specific neighborhood in the city of Buenos Aires, but also every employee who worked in a company or who had offices in that specific neighborhood where the ministerial was going to take place. So the specific law enforcement forces collected, again, fingerprint data from a bunch of people, even if they weren't living in the neighborhood. And there was not much transparency. There was no transparency at all, to say it bluntly. We submitted several information requests to the Ministry of Security, and they basically said it's all a secret operation, so we can say anything. So we're trying to challenge that sort of transparency and accountability when the government just decides to collect fingerprint data out of thin air. And we don't know if it was to also complement the information that they have within CBOs, or if it was something that this specific law enforcement agency was doing as an operation just for the WTO meeting. And another news that just break ground in October. Yeah, in October, during the primary elections, the National Electoral Court implemented biometric technology to identify, as a pilot program, so it was not mandatory, it was voluntarily. In 6 northern provinces, they used biometric technologies to identify the people who were going to the schools to vote. So they would contrast the identity of the person who was willing to put their fingerprint on the reader with the voter registry that they had printed, like the official voter registry. So they did that as a pilot program in order to not go through a legislative process to reform the electoral law, but there's nothing that blocks them from actually reforming the law, even more so when the executive now is trying to push for electronic voting. So we've seen those 2 big cases in terms of how the state is actually broadening their activities concerning the collection of biometric data. That leads me to the final points that I want to make, and please tell me if I'm good on time. Okay. So in terms of threats, the threats that biometrics in itself pose to human rights, I wanted to start first saying that there's been in the past, I don't know, five years, I guess, naturalization in how biometric technologies are present in our daily lives. So if you have a smartphone from the last 5 years, it most certainly will have a fingerprint reader. So if you have an Amazon Echo or Google Assistant or whatever voice assistant that's on the market right now, you've given your voice recognition patterns to a company. So we've seen several biometric technologies being introduced to our daily lives, and we've sort of come to a point where it's natural for us to just unlock our phones with our fingerprint, or now with our face. So that in itself is a little bit tricky because people are not thinking on the ways that it may affect them in terms of how am I allowed to exercise my rights, or how does that interferes with certain liberties that I have. And another thing is with biometrics, talking about like inherent vulnerabilities of the technology, biometrics are essentially public, so we can all see our faces, we can all take photographs of ourselves when we're at a public venue or a public space. We leave our fingerprints in a bunch of stuff that we touch throughout the day, and they're easily recovered by forensic methods that are pretty cheap. There's a really big case at the CCC, I can't remember if it was last year, that a hacker showed how he recovered the fingerprints of the Ministry of Defense, of the German's Ministry of Defense, from just a photo. And it actually worked. That leads me to another point, which is that biometric information is not easily replaced, or cannot be replaced at all in some cases. Your fingerprints cannot be replaced, your face cannot be replaced, your blood cannot be replaced, your DNA. So we need to think that when we're talking about, like, for example, when the government wants to implement biometric systems, replacing passwords, for example, or when they talk about how the systems are not vulnerable or are actually really accurate. And we've seen through a lot of research, I just want to highlight the research done by Georgetown University on facial recognition and how algorithmic bias is actually a thing, and not even big law enforcement agencies from the US run tests to acknowledge what algorithmic biases their systems are actually incurring. So basically, the discrimination that Georgetown discovered is that in the US, almost a lot of people of color are identified as possible criminals more than white people. And that's actually a thing that we need to address if we want to implement systems critically, is how accurate are they? Who are the people in charge of, say, developing the technology? Are the people in charge, do you have, I don't know, a multicultural group within the people developing the technology? And I will only end with saying that biometrics, when we talk about like the implementation on public spaces, it's taking to a point where we are redefining what we understand as public spaces, where we, maybe a few years ago, we believed if we were in a park, we would be, we had certain anonymity. And now with CCTV and facial recognition, that's not the case anymore. Not even with friends tagging us on Facebook photos at a party, where we thought, okay, no one's going to tag me because I don't have a Facebook, but Facebook is running face recognition algorithms even if you don't want to. So those are some starting points just to kick off the debate after we have some questions from the audience and from other panelists. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Leandro. As Leandro was saying, there is a trend in Latin America in implementing biometric identification and particularly fingerprint identification, allegedly for safety reasons, for public safety reasons and to curb delinquency. And Martin, Peru is also implementing more and more uses of fingerprint identifications, allegedly for safety reasons. However, there seems to be also similarly as in Argentina, a lack of adequate public policies in place for guaranteeing certain controls with regard to the safeguard of this personal information that is being gathered. Would you please tell us a little bit about the Peruvian experience in implementation of biometrics technologies? And do you think that in the Peruvian case particularly, but also in Latin America as a whole, is it possible to address this issue just by creating certain standards of responsibility on how this data is managed?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Marianne. And yeah, definitely yes. And maybe that is the very best challenge that our government has nowadays, is to explain and decide how to implement biometrics in an environment of legality, necessity, and proportionality. In Peru, the biometrics legal framework is not a good example of that. Its implementation was a product of different interests by different entities that wanted to use biometrics. But unfortunately, the discussion of this implementation never passed through the Congress. So today we have an obscure and an unknown structure of how biometrics works, if it is safeguards, who use it, who process the biometric database, and most importantly, who control it. Well, the Peruvian case is quite a mess. So I wanted to, firstly, to give you some details of the background of the law and the early uses of biometrics in Peru. And secondly, I will address some mapping of the entities that are using biometric verification. Well, in Peru, biometric verification has been implemented for more than 20 years. In the early 90s, was used to identify the official of the National Register of Real Property, the SUNARP. And afterwards, the National Identity Register, the RENIEC, began to use fingerprint recognition to collect biometric data of all the citizens. Since 2006, and as an entity responsible for issuing the IDs, the RENIEC acquired the automatic identification system of fingerprint impressions, the AFIS, is a software from the company Morpho. Despite the fact that this software initially served to detect duplication of registries, impersonation of IDs, fraudulent identifications, and to find people with unknown identity, it was and now it is the responsible for processing the fingerprints digitally obtained in the re-enrollments. Since that, the use of biometric verifications has increased exponentially. In 2013, the AFIS was updated with the promotion of the use of the electronic ID card. This system began to collect fingerprints of both hands and facial features of the citizens. It went from being a bidactylar to decadactylar with two-dimensional facial recognition. So not only RENIEC expanded the number of records in its database, but also the monopoly of the ID verification. As you can figure, the owner of our identity become a digital authentication system. Although all these measures were aimed to reduce the level of fraud in commercial transactions and to increase security, RENIEC started promoting the implementation of this intermediary without transparency. Actually, we don't know who manages the database, how the fingerprint biometric registration is designed, which digital certificates are implemented, or what parties are involved, or whether it is limited to public agency or shared with private parties, locally and externally. Today, there are several private acts that require biometric verification. Obviously, this service is provided by RENIEC. In fact, the public budget for 2018 states that RENIEC will provide this service without charging any fee. Some of them are the public notaries, the real estate registries, the commercial banks, to qualify and approve some transactions, and since this year, mobile phone providers. This last thing is related to the creation of a registry of cell phone users, in which every mobile provider has to gather biometrics from its customers and match it with the SIM card and the cell phone that he or she is buying. It is important to mention that in Peru, these providers are also obliged to give metadata from their users to the police without a warrant. So the use of biometric verification closes the perfect circle of mass surveillance, which is CCTV, metadata, and biometrics. Continuing with the recount of uses of biometrics in Peru, the Border and Migration Offices has recently issued new biometric passports and use such data to identify travelers. The AFIS is also used in the courts and the prosecutor's office to identify convicts and condemned people with domiciliary prison who have to register his or her fingerprints every month in the criminal court. Looking forward, the progressive implementation of electronic voting that Peru is promoting and the encourage of the use of electronic ID is a matter of concern. To conclude, as you can see, our public policy about the use of biometric information remains unclear. It seems that the government started to use this service without considering transparency. And we as owners of our identity and personal data, we need to know how the public and private policies are applied, how the interoperability exposes our biometrics information, and how could it affect, limit, or helps the exercise of other rights, such as privacy and anonymity. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. As we have been seeing, there is this constant discourse that is about a tension and a trade-off between different rights. Smith, India has been building and is still building the world's largest biometric database, which is supposed or is being framed as something to help boost the country's digital economy and help include people who's been long excluded from education and health and social services systems. However, its validity as a mandatory system is contended, something that it might be violating basic human rights. So what do you think about this trade-off? Do you think that while we may recognize that including these people who have been, in fact, excluded from basic rights is something that is necessary to do, and while biometrics might be useful for that, do you think that trade-off justifies that uses? Can you tell us a bit about India's database?
Sure. Thank you, Marianne, for putting this together. Specifically to your question, my immediate answer is that we can answer this on two different levels. First, there's a very basic concept that your fundamental rights cannot be traded or should not have to be traded for whatever cause there is. And second, specific to this particular question that you mentioned, that the biometric database in India is being portrayed as something that will help include people who do not have access or people who are being denied access to social welfare schemes that are being provided by the government. And while the right to food, the right to life, whatever the case is in each particular scheme is important and it is a fundamental right, there's a lot of data that suggests that this particular biometric identity system isn't really going too far in helping improve the situation for these people. So I'll just take a few steps back here and explain how the project came about. The idea of a biometric identity system at a national level was first proposed, I think, back in 2009. The project was meant to be implemented by the Unique Identification Authority of India, and was put in place again by way of an executive order, not a law passed by Parliament, similar to what happened in Argentina. The idea was to provide a way to verify the identity of individuals, including the individuals who didn't have existing forms of nationally or government-issued identification, and use this verification to target the delivery of welfare schemes that the government has in place. Many of these welfare schemes have traditionally been plagued by issues of corruption with, for example, if it was access to food grains, the grains would be siphoned off by middlemen. And the argument that was made was that putting in place such a system that has individuals' identities verified would help get the benefits directly across to them. So this unique biometric-based identity number is called Aadhaar, and it was meant to be very easy to obtain. Any resident could apply for it, and they needed to provide the demographic information as well as biometric information, so your fingerprints, basically. And where residents didn't have any other form of ID, they could be introduced by another resident, and that would be sufficient to kind of prove their identity. But since 2009, the use of this biometric identity system has expanded by leaps and bounds, and there have been attempts to make the use of this number mandatory for most government services and for many private services as well. And this literally ranges from your birth to death, because newborns are being enrolled with Aadhaar numbers, and you require, in some cases, I think in quite a few cases, a number to be provided to issue a death certificate of a person. And all of this has happened despite the fact that, firstly, between 2009 and 2016, there was no law in place. The law only came about enacted in 2016 to govern this entire system. And apart from that, there is to date a pending case before the Supreme Court of India which challenges the constitutional validity of the scheme as a whole. And the challenges are on several grounds. This includes the fact that the biometric identity system infringes the right to privacy of those enrolled. There's national security issues. There's welfare issues. And since 2013, the Supreme Court has been issuing interim orders saying that the use of this number cannot be made mandatory until the court finally hears and decides upon the validity of the scheme. And we're now in 2018, and even last week, the court had to once again issue an order delaying deadlines that made it mandatory to link your Aadhaar number with everything ranging from bank accounts to your cell phone numbers, your SIM cards, to welfare schemes that provide children with free meals at schools, and schemes that provide free access to medicines for people who need it. So at the Center for Communication Governance, we've been tracking this case and writing about it extensively, so I'd be happy to share more information on this with anyone who's interested. And our interest in this case stems primarily from the issues, the privacy issues that are in this context, that exist in this context. And while we did have a big win in terms of the affirmation of the right to privacy as a fundamental right in India earlier this year, the Supreme Court affirmed that this is a fundamental right, there's still many privacy issues that continue to exist within this Aadhaar project. And I'll just give you a few examples. So the law that came about in 2016 says that the number, obtaining the number, enrolling for obtaining this biometric identity number is meant to be voluntary, and that consent must be obtained before the data is collected for issuing this number. But when you make it mandatory for providing other services, that consent becomes redundant. The number itself, the demographic details that you provide, and all the transactions that you engage in using this number, that are linked to this number, are all stored on a central database. And this central database is meant to be critical information infrastructure. It's meant to be secure, but we all have read evidence showing that large databases are almost impossible to secure. The law also makes it illegal to publish the Aadhaar number. But there have been several cases of leaks of this number from different avenues, including different government departments, and there's clearly, at the very least, a need to educate and build awareness of the fact that this is something that's private, it shouldn't be published. And from a more legal perspective, under this 2016 law, the only way to prosecute a data breach is to report it to the authority itself. You cannot go to court. The authority will then decide whether they want to take it further or not. So if I have a couple of minutes, I want to close with three fairly recent examples that show the range of the use of this number and also the complexity of the issues that we see in this context, apart from just privacy. So in October this year, the media in India was awash with this this really sad story about a case where an 11-year-old girl in one of the more rural areas in India she died of starvation because her family was not able to obtain the food rations that they're entitled to by way of the social welfare benefits schemes, because they had problems with, they weren't able to link their Aadhaar number and verify their Aadhaar number, and they just weren't given the food grains because it was assumed that they didn't exist. And this is not the only case that we've seen of this sort. There's several examples of people who engage in manual labor, or farmers who their fingerprints don't work, so they're unable to, the fingerprints are not read by the machines. Or in rural areas, there's no connectivity, there's no mobile or data connectivity, and they're unable to verify their number, the other numbers in time. Moving to a slightly more urban context, in November this year, we saw several reports about how one of the larger e-commerce entities in India specifically required an Aadhaar number, not any other proof of identity, even if it was issued by the government, but an Aadhaar number to track lost packages and refunds. And this is a private company. They have no mandate from the government to do this, but they required it, and we don't know yet why that was the specific case. And my last example is as recent as this week. We've been seeing reports about how one of India's largest telecom companies, which now also has a payments bank, which is like a small bank, while they were enrolling people for SIM cards, they have also automatically, without asking people or telling them, enrolled them and opened bank accounts in their names, and linked this to their Aadhaar numbers. And because these numbers were linked with their Aadhaar, several of the direct cash benefits that government schemes make available to these individuals, whether it's pensions, it's subsidies for certain services, all of these cash benefits were automatically rerouted to these payment bank accounts without informing these people that they had new bank accounts or informing them about where their money was going. So I think I'll close with that, and maybe we can discuss this later.
Okay. Um, Circling back a bit about what all of you have said, there are many cases where the use of biometric technologies that is implemented under a discourse of inclusion has actually been used to exclude people who have bodies that don't necessarily match what the system expects from them. And I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, for instance, in Venezuela, where I am from, the biometrics are used in order to control how people access to food and medicines. And people from LGBTQ communities, and particularly trans folks, have been excluded from being able to buy food at all. And so the thing here is that, as Leandro was saying before, the thing with biometric data is that it's not exactly the same as the concept of personal data that we have been handling so far. Because while it is extremely bad if your, I don't know, your address gets leaked, you can, like, technically, it's very hard, but you can move. But it's really harder to change your face or your fingerprint. And this means that while we address these issues as privacy issues, which they certainly are, there are also many other aspects behind these uses of biometrics data that are linked to our bodies and our concept of selves and of autonomy. And we have been talking about biometric implementation mostly by governments, but there are many places in the world where biometrics are implemented pervasively by private actors for banking systems, for paying systems. We still, at the best case scenario, we still handle this database as just under data protection frameworks. There are some scholars that think that a shift in paradigms is needed. And so, Professor Park, do you think that in societies where biometric technologies are being implemented on a more global level, but not only fingerprint, we've been talking about fingerprint a lot, but also through vein pattern recognition, facial recognition, even gait recognition. Do you think that this entails different concerns than the use of biometrics by states? And do you think that the current data protection framework is enough to regulate the use of biometric data by state actors and by private actors?
I think that either we need something additional to data protection law or build something into data protection law to prevent a phenomenon that I call paradox of trust. By paradox of trust, I mean the phenomenon whereby the more reliable identification system you try to build, the more likely it will be abused, defeating the purpose for which you create the system. I see that phenomenon I saw that phenomenon happening with South Korea's resident registration number. Resident registration number is not even biometric identification. It's just numbers given to all individuals born in Korea. It was invented back in 1970s, primarily to detect spies from North Korea. But because it was implemented so thoroughly to all people born in South Korea, governments, agencies began to rely on the reliability or trustworthiness of those numbers. These agencies and companies began to require production of that number as a condition of providing service or opening an account, to a point within a couple decades to a point where so many agencies and companies have those numbers of many people, which made it difficult for the numbers to operate as any form of a password or to operate as a condition of obtaining service. Because so many companies and agencies have your name and number combination. The other thing is because so many companies and agencies have required these numbers as a condition, the resident registration number became some sort of a key data that weaves through all these different facets of individuals' lives. Libraries, when you check out a book from a public library, you leave your resident registration number. When you go to hospital, you leave your resident. When you go to school, you leave it there. When you get a bus ID, bus pass, you leave a number there. So the fraudsters who want to do identity theft, if they can have access to just this number, they can have access to all different facets of that individual. So imagine the availability of numbers is increasing because so many companies are requiring that. And then the value of the number is also increasing because it becomes a key data through which all these different facets of life can be collated. So what can be the result? Well, Korea is hit with the massive data breaches periodically to a point where I hear rumors that you can buy a database of 100 million sets of Korean resident registration numbers for like $100 US in overseas market, and South Korea is only 50 million in population. So I don't know where they get 100 million sets of. Probably it's overlapping data sets. So what I'm trying to say is the reason that the agency is trying to build a biometric identity system is because of its non-replaceability, they think that it is more reliable. But the problem is because it's reliable, it has the danger of function creep, where more and more functions are added on. More and more functions are made available as a result of using that identity, using that biometric identity. So I think it is very important that when you are trying to build a system that has extreme identifiability, then it is also deeper privacy implication. So when you define privacy, there are two factors here, identifiability and confidentiality. The more identifiable the data is, there's greater privacy implication. Also, the more confidential it is, more privacy implication there. Most people think only about the confidentiality side, but if the data is extremely identifiable as biometric identity because of non-replaceability, then we need to take special measures, and that's what I mean when we say we need something either within or in addition to the existing data protection law to limit the function creep of the supposedly reliable identity system. Can I respond to some of the comments earlier? And because of privacy implications of extremely identifiable personal data, we should definitely put the law enforcement's act of unmasking a person to a warrant requirement. I think Martin mentioned and another person mentioned how accessing the database without warrant is a problem. And the government agencies think that, hey, biometric identity, if you leave your faces out, I mean, look at yourselves. We are covering every part of the body except your face. Why do we do that? Because we want other people to do manual facial recognition continuously, right? I leave my face out so that I can be recognized as you. Although, all this ultraviolet is supposed to kill my skin, but I'm still, I still want to be recognized by you. So the faces are, out there in the open. So the government agencies are thinking that, this is public information. Why should we get judicial authorization for identifying a person? But privacy is not just about confidentiality. The extreme identifiability has its own privacy implication. And it's not about biometric identity, but we have had the experience in Korea where law enforcement has accessed the database of database kept by platforms of the real names of people who put otherwise anonymous postings. We challenged that as a warrantless, warrantless surveillance. We didn't win, but the lawsuit itself forced the platforms. So after the lawsuit, the platforms announced that they'll stop turning over the data unless they are presented by warrants. So that practice of unmasking otherwise anonymous individuals online has stopped. And that analogy can be made to unmasking a person through biometric identity database. It should be definitely subject to warrant requirement. I think this is an emerging area of law. I think we should have, we should take the first step in the right direction, even from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Park. Oh my God. Okay. I have heard some people, some particularly people working in the technology field, saying that these issues that we are posing aren't actually issues about biometric technology itself, but about the way the biometric technologies are implemented. Like, for instance, the act of unmasking someone before an administrator, be it public or private, isn't really necessary. That, for instance, someone that is going to allow us to use, I don't know, a health system, a public aid system, needs to know if our fingerprint matches the set, but they don't need to know our name and our address and all of this other information. And so there are people who who propose as a solution that it's just about the way the systems are being built. So, Olivier, most of these initiatives regarding biometric identification systems portray them as an opportunity for the achievement of social and economic rights. And these are actually issues that we are accepting that exist. Do you think that there are technological measures that can be taken in order to take advantage of the possibilities of biometric technologies while at the same time protecting other human rights that are in tension with this application? Will you tell us a bit about your experience working with biometrics?
Yes, of course. So I am Olivier Alès. Yeah, I have been working on a project for about 1 year now in Thailand at the border with Myanmar. It's to build a non-profit e-health microinsurance for migrants in Myanmar, and we need to know that in Thailand today 3.5 million people are migrants, especially from Myanmar, and 1.5 of these migrants are illegal, and they don't have ID. There is no way to recognize them because they don't have ID. And all these migrants used to go in 2 different clinics at the border with Myanmar, the SMRU and the Mateo clinics, just to have access to e-health infrastructures. And so it was working for quite a while until this clinic was not able to be still free. And some people, especially from Doctors Without Borders, thought how we could build a non-profit e-health miracle insurance for these migrants. And with people, so they don't speak English, most of them speak Karen, they don't have an ID. And so also we wanted to have something really mobile. And so to have the possibility to go on the field and to recognize these people. So we test, just to reply to your questions, we test a lot of different solutions, especially to the fingerprint system. And for most of these people, it was not working because they are workers and the fingerprint, most of the time, they are quite bad. And also because we were not able to bring the technology in really rural part of Myanmar and Thailand, so we needed to have something very light. And so we came with one solution. It was to have a tablet and to have a, system, a specific system on this tablet. And with this tablet, we were going to meet all the different migrants, especially in Myanmar and a bit also in Thailand, and build for them a small ID. And so we were taking a picture of them, and we were giving them also a card, already printed card with a QR code. And so they were able to register to this program. And then when they are going to 2 hospitals in Thailand, next to the border, they're able to give this small card, so with a QR code with their name, and someone is able to scan this card and just to recognize them. So the picture is going to pop up, their name also is going to pop up, and we are going to know if they can have access to the clinics or not. So it was a solution that we were able to set up because we were going in some places in Thailand or in Myanmar without electricity, without nothing, and we had to adapt the technology. And so we came this solution. Now the other problem, now the project is running. We have we spent about 6 months developing the platform in Bangkok. The platform was launched in August. We have right now about 1,000 people inside in the program, and where we have more issue, it's on the database. So technically, we were able to create the database, but we are also building a database of illegal migrants in Thailand. So if tomorrow the Thai government want to know all the illegal migrants that are in the territory, they can ask for this database. So it's where we still have issues and don't really have the solution how we could protect this data. We know how technically how to protect it, and so we have been encrypting all the database, but more legally, it's where we still have issues.
Thank you. We're now going to open the floor up for questions or comments. So here, but also for the remote participants. I don't know if there are questions from the remote participants. If someone wants to ask a question, make a comment, say something. Okay, over there. Red button. Yeah. No. Again? Now.
Hey?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. Hi, my name is Veronica Arroyo. I'm from the Youth Observatory. I'm from Embajadores Internet. I'm from Peru. And I know that one of the main problems that we have in the global south is security, but security on the streets. We have a lot of violence on the streets, and that's a major thing for all of us. And one of the easiest solutions that the government have for this problem is cameras. and they are implementing cameras everywhere, and not just on the streets, but also inside buildings, and not just public buildings, but private buildings. I mean, when we see this on a very home environment, maybe if you live in a building, then the community of your building will say, oh, we need to put more cameras so we can protect ourselves from other people. So I would love to hear from you, or maybe you can share some best practices that we can, how can we tackle these security issues, but as well protect ourselves from being in this mass surveillance problem that we already have. Because if we put a lot of cameras, then that gets risks, but people says that we need to have those cameras because they will protect us. But then there is mass surveillance. So how can we mix that? How can we work on that? I don't know, maybe you have some examples that can be helpful for everybody here. Thank you.
Anyone want to jump in? Yes? No?
I mean, just along the line that I outlined in my first presentation, we are born anonymous. That you recognize my face, the features, doesn't mean that you know who I am. Unless you get my ID, get my passport, seeing my face, that's not, that doesn't reveal much about me, right? What it gets, what it picks up, it picks up implications for privacy is when you can match my face with other data about me. So let's say I'm walking around in public space, the CCTVs, record my face. Unless the police can unmask me, okay, unmasking an open mask is open face is a really kind of a difficult thing to talk about. But unless the police can match my face with a certain other official identity, the privacy implication is not that great yet. Well, it becomes privacy infringing is when they do the matching. Now, what we are saying, and probably what Martin is saying as well, is that when the police go back and look at the face recognition database, they have to get a warrant to get my official identity after seeing my face. That can be one of the ways that, I mean, the police will say, oh, it's going to take time, it's going to undermine the law enforcement activities. We are not saying that the police should not do it. Do it, but under judicial scrutiny. Do it when you can prove, when you can show the probability that this person with this face is doing something criminal, or something harming the public interest that is justifying the investigation.
Leandro?
I agree with the colleague in the panel here in terms of the need of a warrant or checks and balances in order on how they access and use the systems. But I would have a slightly different approach in terms of I would challenge completely the implementation of CCTV and face recognition just for the sake of being on civil society, and I don't want those systems in place in my city. The main concern being that they don't usually help at all with the fight of crime, to deal with crime, or they only serve as changing the hotspot. They move the hotspot of the crime in the city geographically, not even realistically, because the crime moves elsewhere where there are no cameras. So the thing with CCTV is that they sell politically. They sell to the narrative of the political party in charge. They are good for marketing purposes, for propaganda. So the thing is that if you want to challenge the implementation of such technologies, your better approach, or your best approach, sorry, is to ask them what are the actual the wins that they got in terms of the fight against crime. Ask them, submit Freedom of Information reports, requests. Martin, I'm sure he will be more than happy to help in Peru. Just fighting transparency in terms of, okay, so how many cases you've solved thanks to the CCTV? How many robs? How many, I don't know, murders? I don't know. So challenging those narratives, basically you need to first tackle what is the problem that the government is saying they are trying to solve. If they are saying problem is A and they don't have evidence to support that claim, that's your winning argument. And I say winning in quotes because we know that the government is going to just do whatever they want. But you have leverage in terms of pushing pushing voters to say, okay, so the government is doing this, they are trying to solve this problem. And maybe if you shift the narrative towards your advantage and make people realize that it's not that useful as the government wants it or presents it to be, then what a public official just wants is to get votes. So changing the perception of how the voters see the implementation of the technology that the politician wants to implement, that's kind of powerful. But again, it depends on the context of the country. I'm not sure about Peru specifically. Maybe Martin can address that. But as a general basis, that's what I would do in terms of CCTV.
Martin?
Yeah, well, I wanted to say the same as Alejandro, but no, we were talking recently that next panel, when we talk about biometrics, we should come with mask, gloves, and voice changers in order to not be identified. But the thing is that we, adding what Leandro and Keyes said, is that we should also request to the government to implement safeguards and to give citizens good remedies to ask for their information, and obviously to educate people, no? Because, for example, when we ask for information about how the biometric system works in Peru, they gave us a guideline. So yeah, you have to put the finger in this machine. No, we don't want that. We need to know what's the security implemented, what's the digital certificates that they are using, who control it or who is processing that data. That's the kind of information that government should give to the people. So I think that yeah, more than the practical things, we should also address the legal issues.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So the gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Nikhil Pawa. I'm from the Internet Freedom Foundation in India. I wanted to respond to that question about security. I think biometrics is a solution looking for a problem. It's being seen as a solution for a lot of things that are just popping out because someone needs to set it, like the point that you made. But if you take a step back, because I come from a country where my biometrics are being forced from me and taken forcibly from me, we need to look at this from a cost-benefit analysis perspective, saying that what is the cost of risking losing this data versus the benefit of having this data. And we've seen very shoddy implementation in our country where, for example, the access to the centralized database was being run by a government department on HTTP instead of HTTPS, because of which there were several, there were apps which were able to access that database and pull data out. We've seen instances where fingerprints have been cloned by students to mark attendance. Fingerprints have been even stolen to create fresh national IDs, which are fake national IDs, right? And as we know, fingerprints can be cloned from photographs. I've just left my fingerprint on my phone, even if I touch the screen. The risk of losing this data because it can't be changed, it is permanent, is far too high for it to be allowed to be collected and stored and shared. Unfortunately, in India, we're doing all of those things. And I would urge everyone to avoid going down this biometrics path because it puts people in danger. I would see this as a human rights violation.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back had a comment.
Yes, hi. Sorry. Hi, my name is Saeed, and I'm an APSEC Amazon Fellow coming from Afghanistan. There was a study by National Law University in Delhi, India, where it says that countries with a poor democratic record more likely to mandate an identification system, and they gave the example of Aadhaar in India. Like Professor Park said that we need to have these data protection laws. For countries like Afghanistan, where we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a similar identification system, where we are trying to collect biometrics of citizenship so that we can provide them better security against terrorism and the whole 9 yards. So in a situation where we don't have data protection law to protect the citizens, but the government is far ahead in implementing an e-government project, such as we call this e-Tazkira project, where my colleague is the director of that particular project, is way ahead of these legislations coming forth and protecting the data of the citizens. So I believe from e-government perspective, from management perspective, I think it's a lot more difficult, and just like the other gentleman said, that we need to educate people. So we're in a situation that we need to educate people, we need to bring in laws, but yet the government has reached out so far ahead in this particular aspect, which shows that poorly democratic nations, for some reason or the other, they prefer using biometric systems. And it kind of answers a lot of our questions, but then again, we need to address that probably. It's not a question, just a comment. Maybe someone can get some kind of feedback on that. Thank you.
Thank you. To take it back to the panelists, there was a question over there, or a comment, I don't know.
Hi, my name is Joan Lopez. I'm from Colombia. And in Colombia, we have a huge problem called the citizen folder. And it's a centralized database with all the data that we produce in our relation with the state. It's put all this information on internet, centralized. So, and they are contracting out this system, and they are creating access through biometric information. So we have all these issues that you have mentioned mixed in one big problem. So we have privacy problems, surveillance problems, inclusion problems, and welfare access to, and also the problem of contracting out and leaving our data, the biometric database, which are private. So my question is, recommendations to address this? That's all.
Oh, there are some recommendations. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to add that comment with the last comment of the guy from behind, is that commonly the governments exclude themselves from the scope of data protection law. We cannot request them access, rectification, cancellation, or object of the right to object to the government. But they are gathering a lot of data of us, of personal and sensitive data, and they are not implementing or they are not respecting all the principles of the data protection law, as data minimization, why you want to use this data, to what thing, or data security. That's a thing that I wanted to put in comment, because it's important nowadays to recognize that the government is not complying with the data protection law, and yeah, we need to do something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a reaction to Martin's comment. I totally agree. I think that we need to be careful when thinking about data protection frameworks as the holy grail, that they will save us from the collection of data by the governments and by private companies. Not because they're bad. Well, usually there's the case in Latin America. In Argentina, you do have specific rights with the government, although the provisions are kind of lax when it comes to the government's inherent activities and functions. But if you don't have powerful and strong enforcement bodies, that framework won't be much useful.
Okay.
So I want to comment that. And the other thing is, that's it? I don't have more time. No, we also need to be careful when talking about biometric data as sensitive data, because not every biometric data is sensitive data under the terms of data protection laws. Data protection laws may vary country to country and region to region, but as we understand, only biometric data that may identify ethnicity, religion, political orientation must be understood as sensitive data. And not every biometric recognition allows that. So we need to be careful when talking specifically about legal provisions in terms of biometrics.
We need to be closing already, but I want to take it back to the panelists for a very quick question, because I'm thinking of the Chilean case particularly regarding facial recognition, and I'm thinking that the way these technologies are being framed by governments and by companies, the society's reaction is often to embrace them because they actually think that this is going to solve their problems. So I would like for you to please tell me, like, real briefly, how has each of your countries reacted to these implementations in means of the general population? You know that we as activists feel very strongly about this, but that might not be always the case, and this has a lot of influence in our ability to actually fight these implementations and to advocate for other solutions. So Smita, please.
Sure. So I think, in the Indian perspective, I think initially most people just, with the biometric identity system, most people just accepted it for what it was because there was some level of trust in the government that, this is something that will be helpful to people. But increasingly, we're seeing so many failures of the system that I think that, I don't know, maybe this is me being optimistic, but the tide is changing a little bit. Sadly enough, I feel like it is probably changing because increasingly the middle class and the upper class are being affected by this because, now the linking with the bank accounts, the linking with your phone numbers, those things are coming about now. Initially, it was just welfare benefits that don't really affect middle class and upper class people. So there is some talk about whether, at least in this sense, there's some talk about whether it's necessary or how, the fact that there's so many failures and how to fix that. Yeah, we'll have to see where it goes. I also quickly wanted to talk about the report that we did, the study that we did. So the reason we did that study really was because one of the bigger arguments that is being made constantly by the government is that, everyone's doing this, everyone's doing biometric identity systems and using biometric technology. It is futuristic. Why are you fighting it? So we wanted to kind of understand if it's true and whether, which countries are implementing it and how they're going about implementing it. So we try to set about a few parameters, the kind of systems that they use, the kind of the services that the biometric identity systems are being used for, whether it's just a passport or whether it's social welfare benefits, whether it's for finance, whether it's for law enforcement, and whether there are data protection laws in place in these countries. And even in India, we don't have a data protection law. We apparently will get one soon, but we're in a similar situation. So I just wanted, so the reason we, we did the studies to understand how this works. So we haven't gone into an analysis and established causation, but there is some sort of correlation between the democratic indexes and indices and the use of biometric identity systems. I also wanted to point out that it seems to be the same companies that are providing these services in all of these countries. When Martin mentioned Morphone, all of these, it's in India also apparently the same companies. I know that they're doing this in a lot of the South African countries, so there might also be a lot of money there that's pushing this.
I don't have mic.
Well, I want
Really
to-
quickly. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to point out that what Veronica said about the people opinion about these policies. For example, in Peru, when the CCTV and the metadata policies were published, people approved it in a consultation for more than 80%. So it's really difficult to change that point of view of the people. So we need to work hard now, and now with all these biometrics issues that we have, well, we are trying to educate people from the beginning. So how it works, how can we handle these kind of policies, and what the government is doing. Only to educate people.
Thank you. Leandro, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, just to address your question. One of the things that we set our minds to do as a goal, as a long-term goal, is to put these systems on the spotlight, giving people enough information to sort of empower them to exercise their rights, to have more information on how the government works, how the state works, what kind of data is being held and collected by the state, and how they're using that data. But the thing is that, at least in Argentina, there's no challenge to the implementation on these policies by the general population, because it's normal, to quote, to carry with you a national identity card that was given to you since a law from a military dictatorship. So people have come to sort of normalize the relation between your own self and an identity number, and that has translated as well to biometric data. So the narrative is pretty strong in terms of why wouldn't I be identified like with 100% certainty when dealing with the government or when exercising civil rights, for example, when I need to vote, when I need to, I don't know, issue my passport, or when I need to travel, when they are keeping me safe. So it's really hard and it's kind of tricky to advocate for changes in these policies, because there's such a normalization on how people perceive the implementation of these technologies.
Thank you. Oliver, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just maybe just that what we were saying and what is important is accountability from governments. And so it's maybe one of the main facts, and citizens governments need to be accountable more to their citizens, and more transparency how everything is working. So it's well, there is also a lot of projects about open governance also, and so accountability for me is an important word.
Yes. Professor Park?
I'll just use this time to tell you the part 2 of the Korean saga of a resident registration number. Because the numbers lost the value as a reliable identification system for the reasons I outlined, the government shifted to SIM card registration. So now, when previously people are required to input their resident registration numbers to use online services, now they input their mobile numbers, and because mobile numbers are required to be registered, required to be matched with official identifications, it also works as an identity system. So yes, fighting CCTV, fighting spread of CCTV is I mean, it's a great goal. But as Martin said, I think train has left the station. I mean, all the individuals are carrying around cameras to take pictures of whatever they see in public places, asking only the government, only the police not to take those pictures. It is a politically very difficult statement to justify at this day and age. I think a better fight, more effective fight can be had in stopping SIM card registration and stopping other forms of identification creeping up. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for this very interesting conversation. Sadly, we are out of time. And I want to thank you all of you for coming and for listening and for asking great questions. Thank you. Have a nice day. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great having you.
You had a hard time moderating the session.
Yeah.
You did a great job.
I had a very hard time, yes. I was hoping nobody noticed, but I think that it was very obvious.
I know. My name is Scott. I hope okay, yes. Controversial. As always, a pleasure. Pleasure to work with you. Yeah. Tonight.
There's a mic.
I hope